When you hear the word crisis, what is the first thing that comes to your mind?
Chaos. World hunger.
Anarchy.
And they were like, oh,
Donald Trump. Flint, Michigan.
A big problem.
The word crisis has a completely different meaning to comic book readers. In the real world, it's a wide-reaching, extremely dire event that brings the whole world together. In comics, it's a wide-reaching, extremely dire event that brings the whole universe together. See? Different. A crisis event refers to a big storyline, normally relegated to its own miniseries, that has a lasting effect on the continuity of the universe. They are normally associated with taglines like, "Nothing will ever be the same," which loses its effect, the 80th time you hear it. These types of stories occur in every shared comic book universe. Okay, maybe not Archie, but you know what I mean. But the ones with crisis in the title, those occur in the DC Comics universe. That's the one with Superman and Batman. So sorry, no Iron Man or Spider-Man for the majority of this video. There are 3 main crisis events. Number 1, Crisis on Infinite Earths from 1985, written by Marv Wolfman with art from George Perez. This one involves the villainous Anti-Monitor destroying the DC multiverse until only one Earth remains. This book was integral to streamlining DC's continuity and publishing line in the 1980s. Number 2, Infinite Crisis, written by Jeff Johns with art by Phil Jimenez. This one is essentially a direct sequel to the first Crisis, and it involves refugees from the destroyed Earths returning to the last remaining Earth to alter it to make it more like the ones that, went bye-bye. This one also kind of undid the first Crisis by re-establishing the DC multiverse, which they really need to decide if they want or not. And number 3, the aptly titled Final Crisis, written by Grant Morrison with art by J.G. Jones and Ivan Reyes. This one's confusing, but that's comics for you. More or less, major DC villain Darkseid gets his hand on an equation that allows him to control the free will of all living beings in the multiverse, which is kind of a dick move, I gotta say. If you thought people were polarized by politics, man, you should be worried about the growing divide in our country and its effect on our ability to implement swift action on important subjects like climate change and racial justice. But people are pretty divided on the crisis events too, I gotta say. Love them or hate them, crisis events aren't going away anytime soon. And that might have something to do with the fact that the comic book industry has gone through multiple of its own. Wide-reaching events that changed the industry in ways we couldn't even imagine. Hell, it's going through one right now. It's called the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, first, I feel like I should mention this. I am currently the only one in my shop. I am not expecting anyone the rest of the day or tomorrow, and that's the only reason I have a mask off outside of my house. We are shut down to curbside only right now because of COVID. Otherwise, I have, and my employee, if they're in here, we have our masks up while in the shop 24 hours, no matter when we're here. My name is William Waterose. I'm the owner of Iron Buffalo Gaming and Coffee. I have a master's in learning disabilities, and I loved working with the underdog. I loved working with children, and I was a special education teacher with Sweet Home for a little bit. The whole time I was doing this, I was asking myself if this was a passion or something I could do or something I could see myself doing. Even though I was getting older, I was still kind of confused on what to do. And sometimes paths just open up for you. I realized that the area had some great stores for retail, but there wasn't really a hangout. I wanted someplace that would take care of the community and help the community grow and be open to everyone, not just geeks like us, but everyone.
So unfortunately, now we have to get into the darker stuff. So we got to talk about the pandemic, which is, yeah.
Oh, I was like, how dark? Oh, that dark.
Yeah.
That was how things were flowing when my first year I was open.
Yeah.
We were kicking butt. We were doing well. I was raising money for people who needed it. I was helping donate things for children. I was doing food drives. We had families in here. Here we are going along. Everyone was having fun. Boom.
Yeah.
Like a super villain,
Yeah.
who takes over the world. Everything gets shut down. Broke my heart to stop carrying week-to-week comics. Subscriptions and comic collectors were dropping off. The hobby's dying. Print is dying with comics. The week-to-week, you really don't make much money on unless you have hundreds and hundreds of subscribers, full list. So I unfortunately had to stop carrying week-to-week, and I saved a ton of money by doing so. And I've had other shops reach out to me and say, I wish I could stop carrying them week to week, which breaks my heart because this is the direction it's going.
That leads into an interesting question, because one of the biggest kind of dramatic things that recently happened in the comic book industry for this past, I think it was April, I don't remember, but was when DC Comics was like, we're done with Diamond. Do you think that that is kind of the place where the comic industry needs to go, like more distributors? Do you think that was a step in the right direction, essentially?
I think it was, if handled correctly. And once again, DC, it wasn't handled correctly. They basically went to 2 stores and used those stores as their platform for distribution. So now you have every comic shop in America purchasing comics through their competition. Last I heard, DC Comics is going to cut back to maybe 10 titles, something 10 to 12, that's it. And they're just gonna release those, and they're pulling back, and that's what's gonna go with, and they're gonna use a lot more digital and online. That way they don't have to use a distributor.
And I think this year has been a big stepping point for that issue, where it's like, do we go completely digital? Because there were no comics released for 2-3 months, but if they were digital, they would have just been able to continue reading comics.
But I think this year it opened the eyes of the distributors and everyone in the comic industry that they could go digital, because if something like, again, COVID happens again or something like this, now they'll be set up for the future. In all this discussion to go digital, to go fully digital, there has been some pushback from the community, because when COVID hit, they thought everyone would switch over and people didn't. People just waited. The collectors sat back. The readers sat back and were like, all right, I'm just gonna catch up on the stacks of comics I have. I'm not going digital. For now, the industry is safe as far as going fully digital. I think they're gonna do both. But there was enough pushback where they realized they couldn't fully pull out. It wouldn't be worth the money that they would be losing. I think the writing's on the wall eventually, but I think we're a good maybe 10, 12 years away from full digital. The industry is dealing with everything we're talking about right now, and then COVID hits.
Yes.
Right? So it's just, dear Lord, what do you want from us? You know, like the poor industry is getting the crap kicked out of it. And us small shops, we're getting the crap kicked out of us too.
Exactly.
Hearing all this makes me think it was a good move for me to get out of carrying comics. Unfortunately, again, heartbreaking.
The first existential crisis the comic book industry went through was also the closest thing to a crossover event our world has ever seen: World War II. Almost immediately, comic books became tools for propaganda even before the US joined the war. One of the most famous covers of all time depicts Captain America socking Hitler in the jaw, and that was his first goddamn issue. Showing heroes like Superman and Wonder Woman fighting alongside the Allies cemented the view of many children that we were the good guys and they were the bad guys. But apparently, it was some shitty cement, because not even a century later, look who's back. The fucking Nazis. Where's Cap when you need him?
Oh! Assembly.
Found him! We found him. But what goes up must also come down. Just ask the Hindenburg. The post-war landscape found no use for the propaganda tools that superheroes had become, and only the most popular ones survived. In this time, America was terrified of communists, Satanists, and all sorts of other, ists. This led to the creation of the Comics Code Authority, a government program that dictated what could and could not show up inside of a comic book.
But we never spent an afternoon sitting around like this, reading. What a wonderful thing this would be if they were reading something worthwhile, something that would stimulate their desires to build and to grow. But they're not reading anything constructive. They're reading stories devoted to adultery, to sexual perversion, to horror, to the most despicable of crimes.
The CCA stuck around for decades and stunted the growth of the medium in its adolescence. Comic books weren't allowed to mature because the government was afraid of corrupting the youth. But comics creators found new ways to tell interesting stories. The most famous example being Stan Lee and Jack the King Kirby creating the X-Men so they could talk about the fight for civil rights in their work. But there are so many more amazing examples from creators like Denny O'Neil.
The Comics Code specifically forbade any conversation about drug addiction. So I did a cover. Speedy in the foreground, and he's got what's called the fixins for a heroin addict to shoot up. They didn't notice the seal wasn't on the book? No one in the country? No, we didn't get any letters or anything, nothing. They didn't notice the seal wasn't on the book. Holy cow. Within a couple of years, the Comics Code was gone.
Over time, the Comics Code Authority would lose its authority, and with the reins loosened, creators were finally able to speak their minds through the characters they wrote. And what do you speak your mind about if you're speaking your mind in the 1970s? Why, Vietnam, of course. As public opinion turned against the forces, the creators were allowed to express their feelings more and more. Tony Stark's first origin had him kidnapped in Vietnam and forced to reckon with the effects his weapons had on the country. The Punisher became a Vietnam vet stricken with PTSD, and perhaps no one did Vietnam better than the Mad Wizard himself, Alan Moore, in the greatest comic book of all time, Watchmen. Vietnam was a breaking point for the United States, but it was a turning point for comic books. Gone were the propagandized statues asking children to buy war bonds. The creators had opinions on world events, and therefore, so did the characters. The heroes were beginning to mature. Comics were growing up. This is where we find our first in-universe crisis, and DC chooses to streamline its continuity in order to tell more modern and effective stories. During the next few years, the industry overcorrects from the campy days of the 50s and 60s, becoming grim, hypersexual, and over-violent. Basically everything the CCA feared. The 90s saw a major crash in the collector's market, and thousands of comics lost near all of their value.
It was kind of like the housing bubble popping, but for nerds.
Publishers were forced to sell off the film rights to some of their most popular characters in order to survive. So now you know who to blame for it taking this long for the X-Men to meet the Avengers. Sorry about that. Comics were in a dark place both in-universe and in the real world. But just like everything else, it all changed on September 11th, 2001.
It's 8:52 here in New York. I'm Bryant Gumbel. We understand that there has been a plane crash on the southern tip of Manhattan.
Oh, there's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh, my God. Another plane has just hit. It hit another building. Flew right into the middle of it. Explosion.
Where most mediums took months or even years in order to properly react to the attack on the World Trade Center, comics had it on their pages within weeks. Superman, Batman, and even villains like Dr. Doom shed tears over the lives lost and were depicted lifting up first responders as the true heroes. Perhaps most striking of all was the image of Spider-Man standing in the wreckage of Ground Zero. The hero that was tied deepest to New York was in mourning. But in the midst of all the darkness that followed 9/11, something unexpected happened. Comic books were allowed to be hopeful again. Characters didn't revert back to the tools of the state they were in the 40s, but they did become inspirational. In times of real crisis, people turned to their heroes for comfort. The real world had become a scary place, and some needed to escape to the one where good guys always came out on top.
In fact, many sociologists attribute the mass influx of superhero media in the late 2000s and 2010s to the general rise in anxiety over 9/11.
Infinite Crisis is actually about the return of hope to the DCU after decades of brooding darkness. But that didn't stop creators from continuing to critique everything that transpired in the real world. They just made sure to leave a little more room for hope. Famous stories like Civil War showed the dangers of letting the government go too far, but it also had Captain America surrendering himself in an attempt to heal the divide he helped create. Post 9/11 comics discovered themselves all over again. They were hopeful figures that were also able to hold up a mirror to society in a completely unique way.
And now the pandemic is testing the comic book industry in a whole new way. Will the publishers abandon their retailers and go completely digital, or will they hang on and hope they don't fall off? There's still a lot of questions yet to be answered, but all I know is that this medium has made it through a lot. These characters have made it through a lot. It's honestly surprising that an industry that has been considered niche for the majority of its existence has gotten to the other side of all the conflicts it's had. Who knows what the future holds? I for sure don't. What I do know is that no matter what, I'll be able to find a character I love on the pages of a comic book.
One of the greatest stories I have here was a mother came in with her son, and her son was nonverbal on the spectrum. Great kid though, but he walked in the door, looked around, and got a massive smile on his face. The mother did a double take and said, he never gets as big a smile on his face. What's going on? Are you having a good time? And he just kept smiling and looking around. So I was just taking him around, talking to him, like, you know, not explaining different things to him. Next thing you know, he had a stack of comics in his hand and the biggest smile. And he turned to me and said, thank you. And his mom's like, he's nonverbal. He just said thank you to you. I'm like, hey, you know, he feels at home here. This is what it's supposed to be like. At a time when it's so dark and we need some positivity and some cheering up, it's nice to have the heroes to go back to, you know.